host of Once Upon a Crime. Welcome to the channel and this week's episode. In the summer of 1968, a quiet neighborhood in Scotswood, England, was rocked by a horror no one could have imagined. Two young boys, barely out of toddlerhood, were found dead under mysterious circumstances. The community reeled in disbelief, but the shock would only deepen. The killer wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. She was an 11-year-old girl. Her name was Mary Flora Bell, and what followed would become one of Britain's most haunting criminal cases. A story of innocence lost, of a troubled child turned killer, and a nation grappling with the question, how could someone so young commit acts so dark? In this episode, we dive into the unsettling details of Mary Bell's crimes, the courtroom drama that captivated the public, and the tragic story behind the headlines. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories from history. Hit the bell to be notified each time a new video drops. This is the case of child murderer Mary Bell. Hey true crime fans, guess what? In less than a month, I'll be in London for CrimeCon UK, and I want you to join me. CrimeCon UK is the immersive true crime weekend of the year, happening June 7th and 8th, and it's packed with over 70 hours of programming designed for true crime lovers just like you. Whether you're a curious newcomer or a seasoned sleuth, there's something for everyone. You'll meet forensic experts, criminal justice professionals, true crime creators, and fellow fanatics for 2 incredible days of hands-on learning, fascinating discussions, and unforgettable experiences. I'll be there representing my podcast, Once Upon a Crime, hanging out on Creators Row, chatting with you listeners, snapping selfies, and of course, bringing some exclusive merch just for you. This year, we will be bringing some lighthearted fun to CrimeCon UK in a live stage show. Think you know your true crime? Are you ready to prove it? Join me and Neil and Megan from Mortal Musings podcast for Killer Knowledge, the ultimate true crime trivia throwdown at CrimeCon UK. It's fast, it's fun, and it's your chance to win prizes, bragging rights, and maybe even outsmart a podcaster. From twisted trivia to investigative intel, you never know what you'll be quizzed on next. And remember, we take the cases seriously, but not ourselves. Don't miss Killer Knowledge only at CrimeCon UK. Tickets are going fast, so head over to crimecon.co.uk to grab yours. And don't forget to use my code ONCEUPON for 10% off. I'll see you in London on June 7th and 8th. Let's talk true crime. Mary Flora Bell, born in 1957, grew up in northeast England in Scotswood, Newcastle upon Tyne. Scotswood had not changed much since the war. It was quite a blighted area, with many crumbling and abandoned buildings, with a high petty crime rate and homelessness. Drug and alcohol abuse ran rampant among the population. Mary, who was called May by her family, was 11 years old in the summer of 1968. She lived with her mother Betty and her stepfather Billy Bell. Mary had never known her father, and there was even some dispute about his name. It was either Jimmy or Johnny. Her mother was only 17 when Mary was born. "Take this thing away from me," Betty reportedly said when her baby daughter was first placed in her arms. Betty had another child when Mary was just 2 and was an inconsistent parent at best. Mary and her baby brother were often left with their stepfather Billy or other relatives. They were shuffled between their maternal grandmother and various aunts and uncles. Other than her mother, everyone loved and doted on Mary, a beautiful little girl with a dark pixie haircut and striking blue eyes. Betty's best friend and schoolmate was Norma Bell. Although they shared a last name, they were unrelated. Norma lived next door to Mary and was 2 years older, but 11-year-old Mary was more mature than the teen and was the leader and instigator of their activities. Many of Mary's schoolmates feared her. She was aggressive and often became physically violent when angry. She'd choked one child who angered her and stubbed out a cigarette on the cheek of another. On Saturday, May 11th, 1968, a 3-year-old neighbor boy accepted Mary and Norma's offer to accompany them to buy sweets at the shops. Later that afternoon, he was found wandering, dazed and bleeding. The pre-verbal toddler was unable to tell anyone what had happened. The next day, a mother reported to police that Mary had choked her young daughter, with whom she'd been playing in a sand pit. An officer took the complaint, but nothing further was done. 2 weeks later, on Saturday, May 25th, a 4-year-old Scotswood boy, Martin Brown, was found in an abandoned building by 3 boys. He was lying on his back with blood and saliva coming from his mouth. Meanwhile, Martin's aunt responded to a knock at her door. It was Mary. She'd come to tell the woman that one of her children had an accident. Mary insisted that she go with her, pulling the woman down the street. They arrived to see little Martin being loaded into an ambulance. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. Police investigated the scene and were stumped. There were no marks or other obvious signs of trauma on the boy. They wondered if he could have fallen and hit his head, but there was nothing to indicate a fatal fall. A pill bottle was found near him, so they theorized he may have accidentally poisoned himself. The pathologist tested for evidence of poison or drugs in the boy's system, but the results came back negative. Asphyxia was initially suspected, since there was a slight swelling of the brain, but the most obvious clues, marks on the neck, nose, or mouth, were not observed. His death was ruled an accident, and the case was closed. The day after Martin died, Mary returned to his Aunt Rita's house with Norma in tow. They asked to take her little boy John outside to play. Rita, who was struggling with grief and raising 4 children alone, agreed, welcoming the distraction for her son. The girls brought him back a short time later, after a pleasant outing. The 2 girls returned daily, taking Johnny to the shops or playing games with him. Each time they encountered his mother, they asked about Martin. Did she miss him? Did she cry for him a lot? They wanted to know if Martin's mother, June, cried for her dead son. Rita became upset by the girls' constant questions about Martin, especially since they always giggled and grinned as they asked them. Rita thought that was because of their immaturity. They didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation, or why their questions were inappropriate, she thought. Still, she finally lost patience and asked them to leave and not return. On Monday, teachers arrived at the local nursery school to find it had been broken into over the weekend. School supplies and cleaning materials were scattered around the room. Among the items, police found 4 pieces of paper with childish scribbling on them. The first one read, "I murder so that I may come back." The second note read in part, "We murder, watch out." The third read, "We did murder Martin Brown," and included misspelled expletives. The final note was the most illegible, but again, the writer confessed to killing little Martin. The police decided it was a prank by schoolchildren struggling to process the toddler's death. In class that morning, Mary Bell completed an assignment in which she was to write about a current event. She journaled the events surrounding Martin Brown's death. At the bottom of the page, she drew a picture of a body lying on the ground with outstretched arms. Next to it was a bottle with the word tablet written above it. Beside the body was a figure that appeared to be a workman with a cap on his head and a tool slung over his shoulder. It wasn't noted at that time, but her drawing accurately depicted the crime scene where Martin Brown was discovered. 4 days later, Mary Bell knocked on June Brown's door. When she answered, Mary smiled and asked to see Martin. The grieving mother responded, "No, pet, Martin is dead." Mary replied, still grinning, "Oh, I know he's dead. I wanted to see him in his coffin." Horrified, June slammed the door. Later that week, the newly installed alarm at the vandalized nursery school sounded. Police arrived to find Mary and Norma in the schoolyard. They were questioned, charged with breaking and entering, and returned to their parents until the case could be heard in juvenile court. Three-year-old Brian Howe was a playmate of Rita Finley's son, John, who Mary and Norma showed such interest in after little Martin's death. On Wednesday, July 31st, John and Brian were playing in the neighborhood when Rita went to find them to call John in for lunch. She found the 2 boys playing at a demolition site. She scolded them for being in a dangerous area and gave them each a spank on the bottom. Rita returned them to her house, gave Brian a biscuit, and sent him home. Shortly thereafter, Norma and Mary arrived and asked to play with John. Rita had put him down for a nap after lunch. She told the girls he could not play, and they left. Several hours passed, and Brian didn't return home. His stepsister Pat went looking for him, asking neighbors if they'd seen him that afternoon. At about 4 p.m., Pat came upon Mary Bell sitting on a stoop. Mary asked if she was looking for Brian. When Pat said she was, Mary offered to help. They walked across a railway bridge and looked down into a field known by locals as the Tin Lizzie. The Tin Lizzie was about 500 yards of wasteland, filled with oil drums, building materials, concrete blocks, and other debris that neighborhood children used as a playground. By this time, Norma had joined them. Mary commented that Brian might be playing among the concrete blocks, but Norma disagreed. "He never goes there," Norma said. Pat agreed. Her Brian wouldn't have gone there alone. As night fell, the girls quit the search and headed for home. As it grew later, people became more concerned about Brian, and neighbors began a search party. Around 11 p.m., the tiny boy was found lying between two concrete blocks on the Tin Lizzie. He was stretched out on his back. Grass had been hastily placed over him to conceal his body. There were scratch or cut marks on his neck and face, bloody froth around his mouth, and compression marks on his nose. A pair of scissors was lying next to his body, with one blade broken and the other bent. It was determined that he'd likely died several hours earlier. The post-mortem examination would reveal other injuries. There were puncture wounds on the thighs and legs. The compression wounds on Brian's nose suggested that someone had pinched it together on both sides. The pathologist determined that Brian had died by strangulation, and it would have taken very little pressure to do so for a child his size. Investigators concluded that the killer was another child, since an adult would exert much more pressure, resulting in more bruising or injuries. The autopsy concluded that the killer had tried to wound the child with the scissors, but had not exerted much force. The cuts were superficial, more accurately described as scrapes or scratches. The time of death was determined to be sometime between 1:30 and 5:30 p.m., but the pathologist narrowed the time frame to between 3:30 and 4:30. The chief inspector noted similarities between Brian's murder and the death of Martin Brown, and decided to reopen that investigation. He concluded that there was no doubt whatsoever that another child had been responsible for Brian's murder. But who and why? Hey, quick story. I was shocked when I read that 45% of girls and 32% of boys feel overwhelmed by social media. Moreover, a quarter of kids say it makes them feel worse about their lives. As a parent or grandparent, that's hard to hear. That's why I'm so grateful we found Gab. Gab makes phones and smartwatches just for kids, teens, and tweens, with all the features they want, but none of the stuff that causes harm, like social media or internet access. Gab's Tech in Steps approach helps kids stay safely connected at every stage. My grandkids are 8 and 10, and they have the Gab watch. It has GPS tracking and safe zones, and it only lets them message contacts we've pre-approved. They're just starting to text, and they love the speech-to-text and emoji features, plus all the fun watch faces. When they're ready, we can upgrade them to the Gab Phone 4. It's a real phone, but it's designed to block harmful content before it ever reaches them. Gab Messenger even flags inappropriate messages and alerts parents if something's off. There's even safe video calling that disconnects the call before any explicit image can show. Then it alerts you and shuts the feature down. Gab gives me, as a grandparent, and their parents total peace of mind. And my grandkids get a safe, fun way to connect. Honestly, I can't recommend it enough. Protecting your kids has never been easier. For the best deals, sign up to Gab today. No contract required at gab.com/once. That's Gab, GABB.com/once. Gab.com/once. Terms and conditions apply. The investigation into the murders of 3-year-old Brian Howe and 4-year-old Martin Brown began. The acting chief constable held several press conferences to keep the public informed. Parents were understandably panicked and wanted answers. At each press conference, the constable noted one person front and center every time: Mary Bell. Questionnaires were distributed to the residents of Scotswood and neighboring vicinities. They were used to gather information regarding Brian Howe's case. It was asked where and when he might have been seen that day, if he had been with anyone, etc. Investigators followed up on all promising leads and questionnaires with inconsistent statements or unclear answers. Parents were asked to help their children complete the forms, and every child was expected to cooperate. Mary and Norma's answers were confusing and unclear, so detectives visited them more than once to clarify them. On August 1st, the constable visited Norma at home. He would describe her home as tidy and her parents as cooperative. However, he found Norma's demeanor odd. She answered all questions with a grin, as if she were amused. Most children who were questioned became anxious or fearful. All took the matter seriously, except Norma. Norma told them that she and Mary Bell had been together during the critical time in question, between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. After concluding their interview with Norma, detectives went next door to talk to Mary. The Bell home was in stark contrast to Norma's. Mary's house was described as peculiar. In particular, detectives said it was not warm or inviting and had very few furnishings. It was also unkempt, cold, and drafty, and there were no personal touches typical of a home occupied by a family. No family photos, toys, or decorations. Mary's mother was not home, and her stepfather, Billy Bell, finally let detectives in after initially refusing. Oddly, he identified himself as Mary's uncle. He said Mary had no father, and her mother Betty was, quote, away on business. After questioning Mary, investigators remarked that she was, quote, the most evasive child they'd ever come across. Instead of answering questions directly, she would respond yes, and then no, or the other way around, and then go into a long-winded explanation that had nothing to do with the question that had been put to her. They grew frustrated with Mary and ended the interview. Detectives returned the next day to try again. Mary's evasive answers made them suspect she was hiding something. This time, Mary said she recalled seeing Brian with a local boy on the day he was killed. Then she began spinning a tale, saying she had witnessed the boy hit Brian, quote, around the face and neck. Mary added more details, saying she saw Brian's attacker playing with some scissors, and something was wrong with the scissors, like one leg was either broken or bent, end quote. This detail about the broken scissors had not been made public. Now the investigators were very interested in Miss Mary Bell. Norma was interviewed again, and this time the police told her they knew she had information about Brian Howe. Norma began to cry and confessed that Mary had taken her to the Tin Lizzie and showed her Brian's body. According to Norma, Mary told her, "I squeezed his neck and pushed up his lungs. That's how you kill them." Then she warned her friend, "Keep your nose dry and don't tell anyone." After verifying that Norma's details were accurate, officers picked up Mary Bell at her home and transported her to the station for a formal inquiry. A child psychologist sat in on Mary's interview. The little girl denied knowing anything about Brian's death. She said she only knew the details because she'd helped look for him and later had overheard the adults talking about it. She became angry when detectives said a witness had come forward to say they'd seen her near the Tin Lizzie that day, something she categorically denied. Upon being pressed, Mary abruptly stood up and announced she was going home. Until that point, she appeared confident, as if she were playing a game with the detectives that she was winning. When the chief inspector told her she could not leave, Mary retorted, "I'll phone for some solicitors. They'll get me out. This is being brainwashed." The adults in the room were surprised by the 11-year-old's attitude and knowledge of her rights. After additional questions were posed to her, Mary changed her story. Now she said she had seen Brian in the Tin Lizzie, but Norma had taken her there to see the body, not the other way around. The chief inspector next opened a line of questioning regarding Martin Brown's case. He told Mary he suspected that she and Norma were responsible for the break-in of the nursery and the "I murdered" notes found there. She quickly confessed to it, but denied knowing anything about Martin and said she'd only written the notes for, quote, a giggle. At 8 p.m., Mary Bell was charged with the murder of Brian Edward Howe. After being informed of her arrest, the little girl said, "That's all right with me." Norma was also charged with murder and reacted by bursting into tears. Investigators concluded their investigation into the strangulation deaths of 2 preschool boys. They were shocked to discover that 11-year-old Mary Bell was their chief suspect in both murders. They interviewed friends, family members, school teachers, and others to learn all they could about the life of Mary Flora Bell. Mary's mother, Betty, was said to have been a beautiful but spoiled child who exhibited odd behavior that her family indulged. At age 5, she refused to eat unless she could hide where they couldn't watch her. Later, they had to pretend not to see her or play along as she stole her food from the table. Betty could do no wrong in her father's eyes. They were very close. His death when Betty was a teen affected her greatly. She became rebellious, stayed out all night, and skipped school. She began stealing from family members and then from the shops where she worked part-time. Betty was a beauty as a young woman, even winning several local beauty pageants. With long black hair, big blue eyes, and a slim figure, she was popular with the boys. At 15, she fell in love with one of her suitors. The two dated steadily for a couple of years, until at 17, Betty became pregnant with Mary. Mary was the spitting image of her mother, and everyone doted on the dark-haired infant with big blue eyes. Unprepared to raise a child, Betty took advantage of this and allowed others to take responsibility for the baby. As a result, Mary was shuttled around between family members for most of her early years. When she was in the care of her mother, the little girl's life was marked by a series of near-fatal accidents. When Mary was an infant, Betty married Billy Bell. She soon became pregnant with her second child, a boy. The young family was living with Betty's mom, who took prescription medication for anxiety. One day when Mary was just a toddler, she found the bottle of pills and ate several of them. Luckily, this was discovered in time, and she was rushed to the hospital where her stomach was pumped. Betty began disappearing for days, leaving 2-year-old Mary and their 6-month-old son with her husband. She said she was overwhelmed raising 2 babies and needed to get away. Others began seeing Betty in town, reportedly working in the sex trade. It was noted that the Bell family wasn't desperate for money, at least not at first. Betty Bell, some said, had always enjoyed the attention of men, and now used her looks and sex appeal to gain her freedom, receive attention, and get paid for it. When Billy Bell met Betty, he was considered a decent man from a respectable family. Friends said Billy was always sharply dressed and handsome, and he and Betty were an attractive couple. After Betty began running off and entertaining other men, Billy started to drink heavily. The children were left without stable, consistent parenting, and the family fell apart. As a very young child, Mary began exhibiting signs of emotional disturbance. Relatives report that she could not tolerate being held, hugged, or kissed. She pushed everyone away and rejected their affection. Mary was often foisted off on her Aunt Kath and Uncle Jack, who loved her dearly. She spent the majority of her early years in their home. They offered to adopt Mary, but Betty felt insulted by this, saying she would never agree to give her child away. She took Mary away to punish them for suggesting it. However, only 2 weeks later, Mary was dropped off again at her aunt and uncle's house. Betty would come and go, sometimes taking Mary with her, sometimes not seeing her for weeks. This continued for years. When Betty did appear, she often brought drama with her, making up stories for attention. When Mary was 2.5 years old, Betty arrived at Kath's house distraught. She said that Mary had been run over by a truck and was in the hospital. Kath lived about an hour away and quickly arranged to go to the little girl. But before she could set off, Betty sent word admitting the story was untrue. She then told her that the truth was that she'd allowed another family to adopt Mary. Upset and confused, Kath tracked down the family, who told her this was another lie. Betty had only asked them to keep Mary for a couple of weeks while she sorted some things out. Betty returned for Mary a few days later. When Mary was 3.5, Betty took her away again, this time to her mother's place in Glasgow. She lived in a 3-story flat. One day, Mary's Uncle Philip looked up to see the toddler tumbling out of the window. He ran across the room and somehow managed to grab her by the ankles before she fell. Betty had been in the room and had placed the child near the open window. Mary and her brother had more than one episode of accidental poisoning after ingesting pills that their mother always seemed to have lying around. At the age of 4, Mary was hospitalized once more, but now she was old enough to say what had happened. "Me mam gave me the smarties," Mary said soon after she recovered from her latest poisoning. She repeated the phrase for the next few days. "Once is an accident," Betty's sister said, "but 3, and now even 4 times, is impossible." By the time Mary was school age, She was well known to teachers and administrators as a beautiful but rebellious child. They found her clever and amusing, but very trying. She sometimes lay under her desk, stiff as a board, and refused to come out. She would punch, pinch, kick, and hit the other children in the schoolyard, and then be upset when no one wanted to play with her. She would tell tall tales. She was highly intelligent and a creative child. Mary's teacher described her as cunning and crafty. Mary, like her mother, craved attention and didn't care if she was given it for being naughty. In fact, she seemed to prefer it. Mary and Norma's trial began on December 5, 1968. It was debated where to keep the two girls. They were separated and sent to two different remand homes. The welfare agency ran these facilities to serve the needs of children with no homes or families. It was deemed the safest place to house two young girls charged with murder, something the judicial district had never encountered before. It wasn't a secure facility like an adult jail, so to make sure the public was protected from the two accused child killers, each girl was supervised around the clock by a policewoman. Mary's only concern initially was, as she stated, quote, "I hope me mum won't have to pay a fine." Before the trial began, the girls were moved closer to the court. Mary stayed at the Fernwood Reception Center, and Norma was sent to a state mental hospital. Norma's attorney requested that the girl be sent to the facility for evaluation. The judge granted the request. Mary's mother, who had returned from Glasgow, attended each day of the trial. Mary's grandmother, Billy Bell, and his sister were also present. Norma's parents also attended. Testimony during the trial included witnesses who reported Mary's penchant for choking other children. Mary's school notebook, in which she had drawn an accurate description of how Martin Brown's body was found, was presented as evidence. Psychologists had assessed both Mary and Norma in the months before the trial. While Norma presented as much younger than her 13 years and did not fully comprehend what was happening or why she couldn't go home, doctors noted that Mary showed a surprising calmness and maturity when questioned. She still insisted on her innocence and continued to assert that it was Norma who had killed Brian Howe. A child psychologist described Mary as devoid of feeling about the death of the young boys. She exhibited no emotions like sadness, grief, or remorse, he stated. He summarized Mary's feelings that, quote, "death was so final and murder so common that it didn't matter anymore." Mary had expressed that Brian Howe didn't have a mother, so he wouldn't be missed. Her father and older sister were raising him. The psychologist stated that he'd assessed other children who, like Mary, had been diagnosed with psychopathic personality disorder. However, he'd never encountered a child like Mary. The doctor told the jury that none had been as, quote, highly intelligent, manipulative, or dangerous as Mary Bell. When the doctor asked her what she thought would happen to her if she was found responsible for the murders, she answered matter-of-factly, "I've been put away twice, and that is enough. I was a week in Seaham at the remand home, and then 2 days in Croydon. I've had enough punishment." The primary news channels did not cover the 9-day trial. The BBC and ITN networks banned the story from their news bulletins, saying that the trial was inappropriate and unnecessary given the defendants' ages and maturity levels. Norma and Mary both took the stand for cross-examination. Norma's testimony was confusing. She would guess at answers and couldn't seem to follow the line of questioning. The prosecutor had to pose questions repeatedly in different ways to get a coherent or complete answer from her. Mary, in contrast, answered questions quickly, but used sort of a rope-a-dope technique with prosecutors. She would respond with a yes, and then quickly change it to no, or vice versa. She'd follow this with long tangents, which frustrated the prosecutor and caused him to lose focus. Mary had a complicated relationship with the truth. Children generally do. In their early years, they live in a world of fantasy and make-believe, where reality and fiction are often blended. We should also remember that Mary was raised with parents who were not known for their truthfulness. Her mother spun tall tales and lived a life of half-truths and lies, and her stepfather was a person who'd lied to authorities, saying he was her uncle. Neither provided appropriate role modeling regarding truth versus fiction. So perhaps expecting truthful answers from their child was a little ambitious. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before announcing their verdict. Norma was found not guilty on both counts. Mary was found guilty of manslaughter because of diminished responsibility in the deaths of both Brian Howe and Martin Brown. The judge handed down Mary's sentence, stating he would like to order her to a mental facility where she could receive appropriate treatment. Unfortunately, he said, he could not, since no facilities provided this type of care for a person Mary's age. However, if she were an adult, he said he would sentence her to life in prison due to the gravity of the offense. Society should be protected from someone so dangerous, the judge said. However, in Mary's case, a prison sentence was not possible due to her age. He concluded his only option was to detain Mary in a secure facility until it was deemed appropriate to return her to society. Because he could not confidently state how long she would remain a danger, he sentenced Mary Bell to detention for life. The sentence would occasionally be brought up for review to determine whether she was eligible for release. Norma, found not guilty, was released to her family. She would later be given 3 years probation for the breaking and entering charge at the nursery school. She was also placed under psychiatric supervision. Mary Bell finally expressed emotion after being found guilty and hearing that she was sentenced to detention for life. The little girl, 11 years and 6 months old at the time of her conviction, and the youngest serial killer on record at that time, broke down in tears. Mary was first sent to the Red Bank School for Juveniles in Lancashire. She was the only female inmate. She would later claim she was sexually abused at this facility beginning at the age of 13. At age 16, she was transferred to the secure wing of an adult prison in Cheshire. While there, she unsuccessfully applied for parole. In 1976, at age 19, Mary Bell was transferred to Moor Court Open Prison. In September 1977, she and another female inmate escaped and spent several days in Blackpool with 2 men. She dyed her hair blonde and used the alias Mary Robinson before she was captured in the home of one of the men. She was returned to prison and lost privileges for 28 days for the escape. In 1979, Mary Bell was transferred to Askham Grange Open Prison to prepare for her upcoming release. She was allowed to work in town, first as a secretary and then as a waitress, under close supervision. In 1980, at age 23, Mary was released from custody and given anonymity in the form of a new name. She had served a total of 12 years in custody. 4 years after her release, Mary became a mother. Her daughter did not learn about Mary's past until reporters discovered that the infamous child killer was living in a resort town on the Sussex coast and published an article detailing her crimes. She was harassed, and fearing for her and her daughter's safety, she asked the police for protection. She was taken to a safe house and later relocated to another part of the UK. In 2003, Bell won a battle in the High Court to have her and her daughter's anonymity extended for life. Previously, it had only been granted until her daughter reached 18. The order prohibited any aspects of their lives that may identify them from being divulged publicly. In 1998, Bell cooperated with author Gita Serini on a book about her life titled Cries Unheard: The Untold Story of Mary Bell. In it, she tells of the abuse she experienced as a child and alleges that her mother was a prostitute and dominatrix who allowed her clients to abuse Mary. Mary Bell continues to live anonymously, and her whereabouts are unknown. After Mary Bell's trial and conviction, the community breathed a sigh of relief that their children were once again safe. Still, people sought answers. How had this happened? What would compel a child to kill? Over the years, the question of Mary Bell has been discussed in books, documentaries, and on true crime television. Some felt empathy for Mary, as they considered her a product of a dysfunctional family and a crime-ridden environment. While Mary's mother Betty had been mostly absent from her life, she renewed her interest in being a mother to her daughter once she was imprisoned, much to the consternation of the facility's staff. Betty began visiting Mary at the Red Bank facility regularly. She reveled in the attention she'd received from the media as the mother of the notorious child murderer. She gave several television interviews, minimizing her daughter's home life as a contributing factor in her crimes. Betty's self-promotion led journalists to dig into her background. Reports of her career as a sex worker in Glasgow emerged. Betty was known as a dominatrix for hire, who specialized in S&M, or violent sex acts, with her clients. Some reported that Betty took young Mary to work with her, and the little girl may have witnessed her mother engage in these activities. Whether it was exposure to violence, frequent abandonment by her mother, having near-death experiences several times before the age of 5, or some other cause, Mary, at a very early age, suffered a deficit in her psychological makeup. She could not abide genuine affection, but sought attention through bad behavior and power through violence. She bullied and attacked younger or weaker children as a way to feel less vulnerable. As her parents modeled, Mary learned to lie and obfuscate to escape consequences. She exhibited a lack of empathy for others, and she did not display sadness or remorse for her victims or their families. Mary took various jobs after her release at 23, including as a nursery school worker. Her probation officer deemed this position inappropriate in light of her history. Mary began waiting tables and working as a clerk instead. She moved in with her mother, met a man, and became pregnant with her daughter. Mary, still on probation, had to prove she was no longer a danger to children. At first, it was debated whether the child should be placed into foster care. Mary fought to retain custody by proving she was a fit mother. By most accounts, becoming a mother changed Mary Bell and helped her gain clarity and awareness of her crimes. Quote, "If there was something wrong with me when I was a child, there wasn't now. I felt if they could x-ray me inside, they could see that anything broken had been fixed," Mary states in Sereni's book, Cries Unheard. She still seems to grapple with taking full responsibility for the boys' murders, sometimes describing them as accidents, and other times claiming they were a compulsive act. Mary said that Martin Brown's death resulted from a fight with her mother. She felt angry and, quote, blanked out and pressed on his neck, she explained. She said she felt no personal animosity toward the little boy. Quote, "I'm not angry. It isn't a feeling. It is a void that comes. It's an abyss. It's beyond rage, beyond pain. It's a draining of feeling. I didn't intend to hurt Martin. Why should I have? He was just a wee boy who belonged to a family around the corner." She continued to insist that Norma was complicit in Brian Howe's death. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. I hope you enjoyed this updated version on the Mary Bell case. If you would like to hear the original episode from Season 1, there's a link in the show notes. CrimeCon UK is coming up soon. Join me in London for a weekend of true crime on June 7th and 8th. Use our discount code ONCEUPON for 10% off. As a Patreon member, you can get 15% off your ticket. There's a link in the show notes to secure your ticket at the CrimeCon website and a link to our Patreon page. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. Until next time, be good to one another.